Good evening. Welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Katherine Heiny this evening in support of Early Morning Riser in conversation with author Jennifer Close. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window on your webinar open during the event. I will be dropping links to purchase Early Morning Riser from Literati. If you're watching us later on YouTube, of course, there are always links to purchase books right below me in the description. And if you're watching live, you can use the Q&A feature that's available to you on your toolbar to submit a question at any time. And I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the reading and conversation. The conversation this evening. As a reminder, you can also shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, or to have shipped to you anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our events, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. And now I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Katherine Heiny is the author of Standard Deviation and Single Carefree Mellow, and her short fiction has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and many other magazines. She lives in Bethesda, Maryland with her husband and children and is a former resident of London, The Hague, and Boyne City, Michigan. And Jennifer Close was born and raised on the North Shore of Chicago. She's a graduate of Boston College and received her MFA in fiction writing from the New School in 2005. She worked in New York in magazines for many years and then in Washington, D.C. as a bookseller. Girls in White Dresses is her first book. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the awesome powers of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Katherine Heiny and Jennifer Close into your living rooms.
Yay, thank you. I am so excited to be here. I'm going to do a little introduction for this book, which I have right here, which I very much love this cover. I'm just really excited that this book is finally out in the world. Katherine and I met about 6 years ago. We have the same editor, Jenny Jackson, and we were introduced through her. But at the time, we both lived in the DC area. So I'm pretty sure the first time we met in person was at the launch for her first book, Single Carefree Mellow. And I knew as soon as I read Katherine's writing that I wanted to be friends with her. For any of you who have read her stuff, you know she's the queen of one-liners that just like surprise you. And they're sometimes like borderline inappropriate in the best way. And there's not that much writing that makes me laugh out loud, but Katherine's does. So I was so happy to meet her and actually become friends, because I think that's one of the best parts of being a writer is you become friends with other writers. And so Katherine and I became real friends, not just acquaintances. And we actually taught a few classes together. She's laughing because that was an adventure in itself. We would go out to dinner and talk about our projects, and we would set deadlines that I'm not sure we ever made. But we would sort of talk about what we were thinking, what we were going to write, and then we started exchanging work, which is a really big thing. It's like a big step to take. It's like you can be friends with someone and talk about other people's books, but to exchange early writing, I think it took us a while to do that. So I went back to look because this book, I got to read chapter by chapter. Katherine sent it to me, and I went back to look to see when I got the first chapter, which I think was I know it was because I looked. It was in 2018, and part of exchanging writing, and I'll talk about what I send Katherine and what she sends me because it's very different. But part of exchanging writing is so that you can early writing, bounce it off the other person and say, is this working? Is this weird? Do you want to keep reading? And I think I was I don't think I was a great reader for Katherine, because all I would say is like, it's great. When's the next chapter done? And I think I gave like 2 comments throughout the whole thing. But I just love these characters. The thing about Katherine's writing is she's funny. She's always funny, but that's not all that's there. She does one of my favorite things in fiction writing, which is like you're laughing along, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she kind of like swings another emotion at you, grief or heartache or nostalgia, and you're kind of knocked off balance. And I love that sensation in writing. She does it so wonderfully. Um, and this happens over and over again in Early Morning Rising. Early Morning Rising is what I call it, Early Morning Riser, which is just that like it's funny, but it's also heartwarming, and there's these characters that stay with you, and it's just a joy. It's just a really, really, I can't say it enough, wonderful book. Um, that if any of you have not read it, I would say buy it immediately right now. I just think it will make you happy. I think you'll love being in this world. So hopefully I've embarrassed Catherine enough with that introduction. And yeah, I'm gonna check to make sure. Catherine's, we're just gonna go right into the questions unless there's anything else you would like to add before we get going.
I just want to thank everybody for coming and say that in pre-pandemic times, I used to thank people for coming and saying that I knew how easy it was to stay home in your pajamas and watch Netflix. But now you can stay home in your pajamas and watch readings. But I know how much Zoom fatigue everyone has. So I'm extra grateful for people showing up. Also, you're a really good reader.
Oh, we'll talk about that later. I don't know that I ever gave criticism for this book other than like, could you write it faster? I need to see what happens in the next chapter. But thank you. I think I had a couple comments, but yeah, I just loved it. All right, well then let's get going. One of my favorite things to ask writers, especially because I talked about the first part of the book I saw, which you sent me chapter 2 first. What's the chapter 2 in here? I'm not sure if you wrote that. I think you wrote the first chapter last, or maybe we're kind of fiddling with it. But I always love to know what the first scene was that you wrote, what the first character or image was that came to you from this book.
Well, I actually started writing a different book about a brother and sister who hire a man to get in a car accident with their aging mother because they want her to stop driving. And the man that they hired is this sort of local woodworker Lothario guy. And I couldn't make that novel work, but I really liked the woodworker guy because, you know, when they approached him about getting in this paid accident, he was just like, well, okay, if my insurance premiums don't go up, I'm all for it. And so I started the new novel, and I knew that I didn't want to tell it from his point of view. I wanted to tell it from the new woman in his life who would have to deal with him having like this legion of ex-girlfriends and ex-one-night stands. And then right as I was starting this new novel, my son's third grade teacher told me that the DEA got a tip that her neighbors were growing and selling marijuana in their house. So they came and kicked down the door, but they had the wrong house, so they kicked down the teacher's door. And she was at school with her husband, who's a teacher, and they had to go home, and it was pajama day, so they had to go home in their pajamas and deal with the DEA. So the sort of the joke about it being pajama day opens the book. And that was the first scene that I wrote, but then I skipped ahead to the second chapter. I don't write always chronologically.
We're going to talk more about your writing process because it fascinates me because Catherine and I work very, very differently. So I'm constantly like, just tell me what it's like to live in your head and in your writing world. But we're going to get to that later. I love that. I love the pajama day story. And I love that Duncan, that was the first character that came to you, which is so interesting. I actually didn't know that. Great. As I was reading these chapters, I think one of the only questions or comments or edits I had about everything you were showing me was like, tell me more about Boyne City. And I actually that's what I want you to do now. I want you to tell me about Boyne City and sort of why you set the novel there. and just about the setting and what was appealing about putting a book there.
Well, I grew up in Michigan. I was born and raised in Midland, Michigan, and we vacationed a lot in Boyne City when I was a child and a teenager. And then after I got married, my husband and I bought a house there because we moved a lot and we wanted our children to have more stability. And so it's such a special place to me. Both of my sons took their first steps in Boyne City, the younger one in a bar called The Sportsman, which is really, mothering at its finest, but the floor was really sticky. I think he wanted to get his hands up off it. And Boyne City is such a small town. It's so beautiful. It has the most beautiful sunsets in all the world. We had to edit some of them out of the books. There was one like literally every chapter. And beautiful beaches. And I've exaggerated the small townness of it, but it was definitely there, the sort of the good and the bad. And I remember one year when the first year that we moved there, we didn't have Wi-Fi at the house. So I used to go creep out into the garden to the edge of my neighbor's property at night to check my email. And after maybe the third day of doing that, somebody in town was like, "Why are you going over to Ralph's house in your nightgown every night?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't know people were watching." But also, my sons learned to ride bikes there. They learned to drive there. They got their first jobs there. And my older son worked he interviewed at a pizza place in Boyne City, and they asked him how fast he was on a scale of 1 to 10. And he thought about it for a long time and then was like, maybe a 5, maybe a 5.5. And the fact that he still got the job, that to me is like Boyne City. It's just, everybody knows everybody. There's a lot of acceptance. And I think that's one of the big themes of the novel, is that sort of acceptance, as well as everybody knowing every last thing about everybody else.
Yeah, which makes for such great tension in the novel. I just appreciate that he was really honest with that interview. I remember you telling me about that, and I think they were like, "Yeah, you're a 5.5. Come on in." Yeah, I love that.
It was a 5.5. I think I'm like a 4. So there you go.
The title of the book, Early Morning Riser, was not the first title, but it is the title of a folk song. And I just was wanting you to talk a little bit about the role that folk music plays in the book, and then also just your opinion on folk music, which is another thing I don't think I knew before I read this book, and just sort of, why you wanted to write about that, how it worked itself into the novel.
Well, I've always liked folk music, and it's sort of part of Northern Michigan for me because we used to go hear this singer named Sean Ryan, who he helped me with some of the song selections for the book. And he was a folk singer in Northern Michigan. And I remember that being something I could do as a teenager with my parents when I could basically not stand to do or be seen with them in any other setting. So I've always liked folk music, and I had sort of come up with the idea that this one character, Frida, would be addicted to playing her mandolin. And lots of songs are referenced in the novel, but in each chapter, a song is actually quoted. And I think one of the beautiful things about folk music is that you can find, whatever you're going through, there's going to be a song that's not just sort of about that. There's going to be a song
something
almost exactly about that. But it's funny because I thought that I had made Frida up totally. And then I was telling a friend about how the first time I brought my husband home to meet my family, when we were just in the early days of our dating, my parents and my godparents came to the airport, and my godfather brought his ukulele, and he'd written a song about me and Ian, and the four of them sang it when we came off the plane. And I don't know why Ian just didn't like turn around and go back to New York and never have anything to do with me. But I was telling this story, and my friend was like, "Oh, it's like Frida in Early Morning Riser. And I was like, oh, yeah. So it's weird, these things as a writer that you think you make up and it's really obvious to everyone else that you don't. It's scary.
It's funny how, yeah, you steal from real life, but it's only later that you're like, oh, that's what inspired it. That exact story that I told you, that's almost exactly like this one in the book. Huh, what a coincidence. Yeah. I remember you telling me that story. I actually don't think when you told me the story of them all meeting them, you told me the song. So I didn't know that he sang, which is amazing. I love that. Someone asked me this question. I think I asked you this question in another event because I really like it, and it just makes me think about my own work and the work of other writers in an interesting way. But the question was, I think it was Courtney Sullivan who asked me the first time. She said someone had told her, so now we're just repeating over and over again, that writers are always writing about the same thing. We're like kind of writing the same book over and over again. And I was curious if you thought that was true. And if so, what are the themes that you think you kind of keep coming back to?
I think it's really true. And actually, when I read a book I like, then I want every book that author writes to be basically the same book in a little bit different form. Like I don't do well with change. Blue M&Ms put me back years in terms of, security. And also, I read this thing not too long ago saying about where somebody was saying that the first chapters of Stephen King books are interesting because you know that something interesting is going to happen. And I was like, oh, so he's sort of, it's interesting because you expect it to be interesting. And I thought that was really fascinating. So I think that everybody re-explores the same themes. And I think that I think that I write a lot about house guests and the extreme difficulty of being seen in your bathrobe by people you're not related to. I think that may be the hardest thing we do as people. But I also write a lot about sort of acceptance and this is so boring, I can't believe I'm about to say it, but like what makes a family is very interesting to me because I don't think it usually ends up being just your husband, wife, 2 children thing. I think it's often so much more complicated and interesting than that.
I don't think that was boring at all. That's one of my favorite parts of this book is just the sort of this crazy group of people who like drive each other crazy and just are, I don't know, they're bananas and they like really form this amazing group. I think I just used the word amazing so many times because I thought maybe I was going to tear up at the idea of thinking of them as a family. What makes me laugh about the house guest thing is that for anyone who's read Catherine's last book, it's like a reoccurring part of the story that this character keeps inviting people to stay in their apartment. That was like your own personal horror story, I guess, is what you were writing. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. You were just like, how can I terrify myself on every page? I would hate to live with this woman who kept inviting people over.
Yeah. Well, I think when I was younger, I wrote about roommates, and then I wrote about house guests, and then I wrote about sort of quasi adoptions and marriages. And I don't know, just the whole thing of like coexisting with people really fascinates me.
Yeah. No, I love it. You get some of like the really bizarre details of humans in here, which leads me to my next question, which could be controversial because I feel like it's asking you which one of your children you love the best. But of all these characters, which one is your favorite? And I guess this might be different. Which one is your favorite and who was the most fun to write?
Well, Jane, the main character, is my favorite. And she was really easy to be in her head. And I think she's much more long-suffering than I am, but also she had a lot of frustration, and that was pretty fun to write. I think my favorite character to write was, well, Aggie, who's Duncan's ex-wife and is in the novel and is really, really bossy. She sort of just showed up in my head. She was like a bossy character. And she was really fun to write because she was just like always so passive aggressive and so undermining of everything. And there was a line that she said late in the book that was sort of not perfectly, it was a little bit ungrammatical. And the copy editors kept flagging it. And I kept saying, just keep it that way. And finally they were like, we really think you need to change this. And I was like, but Aggie will be mad at me.
You remember the line?
It's where she says, Duncan wants her to ride in his furniture repair van. And she said, no, the day that we got divorced was the last day I ride in that death trap of yours.
Okay.
It should have been, I rode or I agreed to ride. It just sounded
like Aggie. Wait, so did you end up changing it?
I did, but I was like, I heard Aggie say that. I know that's what she said, but okay, I'll change it.
She has a line at the beginning where she said, Gary, right?
Mm-hmm. Her husband.
All of a sudden I doubted myself. Gary doesn't hold with leaf blowers. And it's like, what the hell does that mean? Which is what Jane thinks. And she's like, what does that mean? Like, I need more explanation. She really makes me laugh. I really enjoyed, for anyone who has not read the book, and this is not spoiling anything, but Aggie is a fantastic cook. And I really enjoyed all of the descriptions of what she makes and so effortlessly, which was just a fun thing to read about. Okay, so I'm going to get to this part of our writing and how different we are. I teach a few different writing classes, and I actually so I'm always thinking about process, and I'm always thinking about my own process and, my students, and we're talking about it. And I actually don't know if I've told you this. I think I might, maybe I did. But I mention you in almost every class because I'm fascinated by your writing process, because Katherine and I exchange writing, and my first drafts, like, this is before I send it to anyone. What goes on the page is almost just like, I don't even know. It's like a crazy mind dump it's like a ransom note. Like, no one else would be able to see it. But even by the time I send it to Katherine and my other first reader, I feel like I'd call it rustic, if I'm being nice. I have to write my way into figuring out the structure, and I have to write my way into a lot of things. So there's a lot of scenes that never make it in. There's characters that are there. It's messy. And as Katherine and I have gotten to know each other, she has said this thing that like is burned in my brain. And I think about it when I write. I say it all the time to my students, which is, she said, I'm putting in quotes, slow, but I get it right the first time. And that fascinates me. And I like saying that to my students, because I'll tell them how I write. And then I say, like, but also everyone writes differently. So this is how my friend writes. And we both get our books done. We just come at it in totally different ways. But I make you tell me about that all the time, because you really do a lot of the editing in your head. And I just kind of want you to talk about that part of your process. And then I have a few other questions about your writing habits.
Well, that's really funny, because I say something that you said all the time, and I don't credit you for it. I just it's me, but I say it to students, and I've said it in every reading so far, which is, you always say there are a million reasons not to write. Yeah. And I think that's so true.
That's my claim to fame. I mean, so many. Yeah.
Well, but your point is, like, don't give yourself another one.
Yeah.
Just go ahead and do it. So yeah, I tend to, I usually go for a walk before I write, and I work it out in my head a little bit. And then when I sit down, like, if somebody were, if you had a tape recording of my typing sounds, it would be very, very slow with long pauses and maybe a little burst here and there. But, and I don't write chronologically. So sometimes if a scene is not working for me, I'll jump ahead to something where I already know something funny is going to happen and I want to write that. So I do that. So I would say more of my editing process is like stitching things together rather than fine tuning the language. I hear things very strongly. I hear the rhythm of words as I'm typing them. So I don't know. I don't,
That
that's
must
just,
be the poet in you. Before this all started, we were just having a conversation with John. See, Catherine has an MFA in poetry, and as does he. And maybe that's what it is. There's like the rhythm of the words is really important.
I also hear the characters' dialogue. They by the end of the book, they pretty much just speak and I write it down.
Yeah.
And that's great.
I hear that. That happens to me. That's, I think, one of the fun parts about about writing. Yeah. Do you keep a notebook? This I actually don't know. Before you start, or you're just all on the computer?
Pretty much all in the computer. I do keep a notebook but it's like the ransom note thing, the rustic thing where I just write sort of notes and reminders to myself.
Yeah. I'm just going to keep going with these questions about process because I find it fascinating, and because I think there's probably writers out there that are listening. Do you aim for, I know the answer to this, but I'm asking for the crowd. Do you aim for a word count or like a period of time during the day?
If I'm under deadline, I aim for a word count. But I did actually read this thing about like increasing your productivity. And the first thing was like to get up at 5 a.m. And I was like, just never going to happen. Let's go on to number 2. But they were saying that that writing for or doing anything, if you just say, I'm going to do it for 30 minutes is that's such a manageable thing compared to like sitting down and be like, I'm going to knock out chapter 6 today. And that's been helpful, is to be like, I'm just going to set the timer and we'll see where I am in 30 minutes. I think it works for exercise. It works for all sorts of things.
It works for everything. I had a student who told me about the Pomodoro Method, which I'm sure lots of people know about. It was news to me, but it's 25 minutes. And after each 25-minute thing, you get like a 3-minute break. And at the end of 5 of those, you get a much longer break. But it is just tricking your mind into doing it. So I think that's very interesting.
You get to eat like a cupcake during the 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, that happens all the time. You keep writing. I did say, I forgot I was going to ask this, and I was kidding, but now I do kind of want to know, what are your favorite writing snacks do you eat while you're writing?
I don't eat while I'm writing because I just have to focus so much. But like when I'm really working on a novel, like the idea of lunch and what it's going to be and how much I'm going to enjoy it is really foremost in my mind. I mean, you talked about how Aggie is a great cook. Like, I really like to write about what people are eating and whether it turned out well or not. That's very fascinating to me. My husband is a really good cook, so that's part of it, I think.
I love writing about food. I also love reading about food. And Aggie makes these grilled cheese sandwiches on baguettes early in the book that I like. I went back to read this again, and I was like, oh yeah, I do want to try that recipe. I find it very enjoyable to read about. So how, because we've talked about, writing is such a funny job and you can do it in your pajamas, but now with this past year, everyone can do a lot of things in their pajamas. So how has the pandemic changed your writing process, if at all?
I found it really hard. I've had a lot of ideas, and I've sort of been outlining things, but actually sitting down to write, I've been even slower than usual. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I think it's because I always go for a walk before I write. And I think pre-pandemic, I would interact with people on that walk. And like shortly before the pandemic, I was at the dog park and I was talking to this man, and he gave his dog a 10-minute warning that it was time to leave the dog park. And the dog took it pretty well, but I was so happy. And I just went home so thrilled with the world and so happy to sit down at my desk. And I didn't write about that episode, but it was really in my mind of just like how funny people are. And so I think that I'm missing that now. I miss that stimulation. I go for a walk, but I don't talk to anybody because it's all social distancing. So yeah, the pandemic is taking all sorts of, further collateral toll on people's work lives.
I know, it's funny. You would think that we would have this down. Like, we got it. I was like, I have a lot of athleisure. Like, I know how to do this. I've been working at home, but it does just feel different. And that is one of the things, just like your breaks and the dog. Yeah, it just all feels very different. So, I'm gonna, if anyone has questions to drop into the Q&A, feel free to start doing it now. But I'm laughing at this one question. I'm just gonna take it before John gets the questions, because it's actually another one of Jenny's authors who asked this. And she said, what is your editing process with Jenny Jackson? So there you go, Katherine. Tell us. What if yours is totally different from what Helen and I do? And we all find out on screen. Yeah.
Jenny's she's so great, and she's so patient. And actually, when, in the version of the book that you read originally, Jane's mother was only in there twice, in the second chapter and the last chapter. And Jenny was like, I really think we need to see her more. And so often Jenny suggests scenes that I suddenly find I really wanted to write and should have written there. And Jenny's like this voice in my head all the time. I really feel like sometimes people say, who are you writing for when you write? And I think it's Jenny, because I want to please her so much.
I like that. Yeah, her suggestions are very gentle, which I feel like is the great way to do it, because sometimes she'll be like, what about this? And she'll just like very gently keep saying things. But I agree, she does sometimes suggest scenes or moments that I think like, oh, of course that should happen. Of course that should be there. I don't know why it's not already. So yeah, I agree with that. I am curious about this. Jane is a second grade teacher in the book. You are not a second grade teacher, but the details of her classroom are super, super vivid. They're some of my favorite details of the whole thing. You talk about the dynamics between the children, the things she does to set up the first day of class. And I'm just wondering who you talked to, or the research that you did to get those details right. Because if I didn't, I mean, it feels so real. I would think that you had at some point taught.
I did interview my son's second grade teacher, and she was super helpful. And I was, during my children's early years, I was always the art lady in one of their classes, in one boy's class, and then the room mother in the other. So I was like in the classroom quite a bit, and I saw what was going on. And second graders are just like really, really funny, the things that they say, because they have a pretty advanced vocabulary, but they don't really know how to do anything. So you're like having to zip up the coat of somebody who's talking to you as an adult. It's just a very hilarious concept. And then when I was growing up, and the hilariousness of this did not strike me until many years out of college, but there were teachers who used to talk about team teaching, but that meant that like one teacher taught both classes while the other one went outside and had a cigarette break. And the fact that that was called team teaching was always really hilarious to me. So that was sort of the inspiration for the other second grade teacher, who's not Jane, whose name is Mr. Robichaux. And he was possibly the most fun character to write.
He's great.
Yeah, he was pretty good.
I won't ruin anything, but there's something that happens with Hooters, and I just think it really, that's what you think of second grade teachers. Yeah. Amazing. I do like this question. Was there anything, I had forgotten that you added in more scenes with the mom. Was there anything that you took out that you loved, or anything that you added late, any big changes that you made to this, or was it pretty much just tiny little edits?
There were a couple of scenes that Jenny suggested that I cut because they just sort of pushed the humor too far. Things were happening that were sort of almost slapstick. And once again with Jenny, I was like, oh yeah, why didn't I see that? but overall, I didn't change a huge amount.
Yeah, telling you, slow, but you get it right the first time.
Yeah.
Amazing. I will sort of start wrapping up, but please leave. We love questions. I feel like this is something from my teaching days where I'm like, let's get I wish that I could see you all and make you ask questions. But I do love asking what you are reading right now or anything that you've read lately.
Well, during the first part of lockdown, I could only read the Little House on the Prairie books, like nothing more challenging, nothing less familiar. And then I read.
Did you feel like Laura Ingalls Wilder? You were like, we go to the store once every 2 months. This is,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, kind of. Maybe that was why I was so into it. Now I'm really fascinated. But then I read this memoir called Notes on a Silencing by Lacey Crawford, and it's so powerful and it's so beautifully written. And that sort of took me out of my reading slump. And then I read The Body in Question by Jill Cement, which is like a fever dream of a novel. You just sort of.
Is that a novel or a memoir?
It's a novel.
Okay.
It's about a jury. Somebody doing a jury.
Oh.
And then I read In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and that's brilliant too. And then a couple of months ago, I was on Facebook on my phone, and I saw this tiny little thumbnail picture of a guy under People You Might Know. And I had this total flashback to I went to the University of Kansas, and he sat in front of me in a lecture hall during government class, and he had the most beautiful handwriting. And then I saw him at a party in my dorm. I got in the elevator with him, and I was really drunk. And I was like, you have the most beautiful handwriting. And he looked really scared, and he got off on the next floor, even though that probably wasn't his stop. He was just like, so this all came flooding back to me just from this little tiny picture. But I wrote to him, and it was that guy. And it turns out he's a poet, and he has this book coming out in June called Worldly Things. His name is Michael Kleber Diggs. And the poems are just so brilliant and so funny and so luminous. It's like all the things that you want poetry to be, and it sometimes isn't. So I really want to give his book a call out, and also say that KU is still enriching my life all these years later, because here, that party.
Did you remember when you reached out? So you reached out to him to ask about the book.
I reached out to say, did you go to KU and did you take government class?
And did you have beautiful handwriting?
And he was like, I do have really beautiful handwriting. But I didn't have any doubt. I saw his face. I was like, I know this is the guy. And he's so funny and so nice.
I love that. I actually always love poetry recommendations, because I think for a lot of people who aren't comfortable with poetry, which is we're also just talking about, I think it can sometimes feel overwhelming, or like, you don't know what to pick, or anyway. So I do love getting recommendations like that. I always have a compulsion to tell people when they've been in my dreams, which like sometimes it's strange, like acquaintances, where I'm like, oh my God, you were in my dream last night. And then where do you go from there? That's it. That's all you can say. Yeah. Those are good books. Anything else?
Oh,
that's okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure we're not leaving any.
I read Good Company by Cynthia Dupree-Sweeney, which is right behind you, and it was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
I started it, but I'm saving it for tomorrow for a train ride, which I'm pretty excited about, which is great. Yeah. And this book, Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing by Lauren Hoff. I forgot to send this to you. It's a book of essays, and she wrote an essay about being a cable worker that went viral. And her book I love it so much. And not only do Katherine and I work very differently, but we read differently as well. But I don't read a lot of nonfiction, and I loved that essay so much that I picked it up and I was like, let me just read a few pages. And 50 pages later, I was like, oh, I love this. Her voice is amazing. So I would also recommend that to anyone who's, yeah. Oh, and it's back there. I have the galley, but Maggie Shipstead has a new book out that's amazing. Oh, it's not out yet. That's a lie, but it's coming out. So those are my recommendations, but it's truly mind-blowing. It's so wonderful. So I just like to, that's my favorite part of readings. Okay, I think we can probably send it back to John to deal with the questions, but yeah, put your questions in, everyone.
I can see his mouth moving.
Oh, I think, John, you might be on mute. Okay. Oh, wait, let me see. Is it me? Did I do it? Oh, his mic is broken. I'll take the questions. Great. That's fine. Okay, so we do have one. What was the inspiration for the cover? What is your process for picking one? I think this is so interesting because I think it's something you do not know until you're thrown into it. Yeah.
Well, I rejected so many covers that I was afraid someone from the Knopf art department was going to come and strangle me. But then this cover came along and was just so perfect. And I remember the day they sent it to me, I wrote right back and said, I love it. And then before Jenny could reply, I was like, I can't stop looking at it. I kept calling it up all day and looking at it. And it's so perfect. And the artist actually had already painted a lot of beds. So she was sort of, yeah, it wasn't a commissioned thing. But
you have very interesting stories about your covers. I think you found the artwork for your first book, right?
Jenny found the artwork for the first book.
Jenny found it.
I
okay.
found the artwork for the second book, the one that was the
book is, I mean, I love all your covers and they're all, this one, it's not similar to the first one, but it's the same, it's a painting, there's color, you know, it's I think appealing in the same way. The second book, I was devastated they changed it for the paperback because for anyone who hasn't, it's these little origami, are they dogs?
I think they are. I think they're chihuahuas.
It is the cutest. I mean, anyone who knows me knows I love like little things like that. And I remember you sent it to me and there was one that was more like, it was just like a kind of a strange shape, or it was sort of, it wasn't anything. And you sent me the little origami dogs and I was like, oh my God, I want that for my cover. It has nothing to do with my book, but I want those. Yeah, you're always very instrumental. What did the other covers look like for this? Do you remember?
I don't even remember. And it's weird because I don't think I'm very good at giving feedback. I'm just like, I don't like it. And Jenny is very patient about sort of saying, well, let's look at some covers you do like, let's see the kind of thing you're after. So I'm not an especially visual person. I think it's kind of hard for me sometimes to describe what I think should be going on.
It's hard. It's such a funny process. I guess I don't know that I ever wondered what happened, but people will ask like, oh, do you pick it? And the answer is no, like it comes at you. But I feel, there's a whole art department and that's their job. And it is funny because I think there is sort of a gut feeling of like, oh, that's perfect for my book, or, oh, that doesn't represent my book. But when they say why, and you're like, I don't know, I just want something a little different. But it is this funny, just this sort of funny back and forth. And I think I told you this, there was one point where I was looking at so many covers and Jenny said the same thing to me. Tell me some covers you do like of any book in the world. And I was looking at my bookshelf and I was like, I don't think there's any, which isn't true. There's so many.
I know.
But it just starts to like, yeah. And I'm sure the art department had my photo on a board to throw darts at or something. Yeah.
I think,
any
is
other...
my mic working now?
Oh, good. Yes, you're here.
Great. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I had to maybe plug it and plug it back in. Well, I was going to say exactly what you're going to say, which is that if people have questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat. But I'm wondering if we got to Helen's second question about how to write a novel. How do you write a novel versus a short story? And so maybe for both of you as well, your approaches to to fiction. Maybe we already touched on this in talking about Katherine coming from poetry as well in her writing style, but that was a second part of Helen's earlier question.
Well, I think I started as a poet and then sort of reluctantly moved to the short story. Like I think I was in poetry because they're short. There was like not as much time for things to go wrong. I could sort of keep my boot on the neck of the poem enough to control things. And then I moved into short stories, but for years and years and years, I felt like I couldn't write a novel. And I felt it just wasn't in me. I didn't have the range. I didn't have whatever it took. And once I decided that I was basically just going to be a short story writer, then I wrote a lot of short stories. They started coming really, really quickly. But then I realized I was starting to go back to the same short stories and wanting to develop the characters more. So I really backed into writing a novel. And then it became, writing a novel is really, I mean, it's many, many things, but one of the things is that it's fun and you get so deeply into it. And you start to see the world through the sort of lens of your novel. And it almost seems like when you're in that final sprint, it almost seems like the world is sort of helping you write the novel. And I remember very late in the book, I wanted the character Gary to have a health scare. And he's a really sort of bewildered, unobservant, eccentric person. And I didn't want the health scare to be something serious, but I wanted him to have it. And I was wondering what it could be. And my husband went to play squash and he texted me that his squash partner was having dizzy spells and blurred vision. So they went to the ER thinking that he might have had a stroke. And I was like, oh my God, I hope he's okay. And then my husband called me from the ER and said that instead of wearing his goggles, his squash partner was wearing his wife's bifocals. And that's why his vision was blurred. And it was like, wow, the world just handed me what would happen to Gary. I just put it straight in the book. And I remember I texted you the night that happened.
And I was laughing as you were saying, maybe he had a stroke. And just so everyone knows, I'm not a creepy, horrible person because I knew where it was going. Yeah. I do remember you knew exactly it was going right into the book.
Because you were like, you should put it in a story sometime. And I was like, done. I did.
Oh, did I say that? Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're giving me a lot of credit. One thing that I will say too about, I mean, for both of us, I think this is how we moved in from short stories to novels. Because I think in grad school, especially, but in workshop, you write short stories. So that's what you learn on. But Katherine's second book, she said her agent was like, send me the next chapter. And she was like, stop calling them chapters. I said they're short stories. And
it's like, you're really freaking me out with the
character. Yeah. She was like, and it's moving forward in time. So I think it might be a novel, but we'll do what makes you comfortable. And I think that was my first book was a novel and stories, because I think you just have to trick yourself into writing it. So much of writing is just tricking yourself into doing things, but just saying like, fine, then I'll write this one little piece and then I'll write this next little piece, and yeah, making it work together.
You've both now had several novels. So is there like a snowballing effect in terms of process from novel to novel once you kind of overcome that initial barrier of, tricking yourself, as you say, or moving from the story form to the novel in stories form to your second book or your third novel, where I don't know. I've heard writers say that sometimes like the process changes from novel to novel, just as it changes from story to story, depending on the needs of it. But I'm wondering if there are like lessons you pick up, because that first book, I would imagine, there's so much to be overawed by, perhaps, in the whole process leading up to publication, that once that's sort of out of the way, I'm also curious if there's things that you sort of drop away that consumed a lot of the first book process that you don't have to think about or worry about anymore because you know what to expect.
Well, I think after I finished my first novel, then I was like, okay, I'm going to write the second one. And I really struggled. I was like, have I forgotten how to do this? Is it not going to work? And I didn't realize something I now know is that the first half or the first third of any new novel is really hard because you're figuring out the characters. And it's sort of like a train slowly picking up speed. And once you get through those first chapters, then you know the characters, you know how they're going to react, you know what they're going to say, and it picks up a lot of speed. And there is like a sort of grieving process when it's over because you're like, well, I want to keep writing about these people because it's familiar. So I don't know, Jennifer, did you find that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say the exact same thing. I think the only thing that sort of carries through, I mean, I think more about my process now. I think that is partly because of teaching, that I'm like, okay, this is what I do, and this is what I'll say. But I think you do forget a lot about it. And I think with each book I've said something like, this is the hardest, or like, this is something, or whatever. And my husband one time was like, you've said that with every book. I'm like, I don't think so. I'm like, oh, maybe I did. But I will say, yeah, I mean, it sort of, I think the thing that I didn't realize at first was it ramps up. So when you're in the book and finishing it, you're with them all day long, and you can write for a long time. And starting a new book, you think like, great, I'll also sit down and write for this many hours or write this many words. And two sentences later, you're like, I guess I'll call it a day, because I don't, just what you're saying, I don't know these characters yet. And that can feel frustrating, I think, because you're used to sort of getting a lot done because you know the characters. And then I think just sort of that took me a while too, to be like, okay, so it's going to feel like I forgot how to write a book, but I know I've done it. I didn't dream it. I know I've done it. So like, I just have to keep going, but it kind of feels all new again. And just reminding yourself that, I don't know, there's the good and bad days. I think that's the difference in the process now for me.
And there's a question too as well that came in asking if you need to take a break between projects. And dovetailing with that, are you working on anything new right now?
I'm actually writing a short story collection. So that's been kind of a good break after the novel. But, the first short story I sat down to write, I was like, well, it's going to be in Boyne City, and it's going to, like I was so stuck on that one thing working. But one of the stories that I've written is about a woman who gets really drunk at the airport, and everybody I've told about this story looks really nervous and says, is it about me? And it's not, it's about me. So yeah, but short stories are a love of mine. I think I will always write them, but I like writing novels too.
I will say, I think you could write something about Boyne City. Elizabeth Strout is the person I always point to, because she has novels and short stories, and her characters like pop in to say hi. And it's the most pleasurable as a reader to know that town, and to know like, oh my God, I know that woman. She's the one who had the daughter who out of, and you're like, and she's in the same retirement home as Olive Kitteridge. Like, they pop in and out, and I think it's so satisfying. So I think, Katherine, if there's a Boyne City story, I think go with it.
Oh, well, thank you. Maybe
I also don't want, I feel like I've been with these guys for a long time too. I kind of am not ready to let them go, I think.
Yeah, it's hard. It's
Yeah.
you become very invested when you're writing them, I think.
So. Well, you have support for a Boyne City extended universe if your writing takes you there.
Thank you.
Well, we've reached the top of the hour at Home with Literati. So Katherine Heiny, Jennifer Close, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Of course, you can purchase Early Morning Riser from Literati Bookstore. There's a link in the chat. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links in the description below, where you can also subscribe to watch our events if you miss them live. We hope to have you both in the store soon. Seems like there's a light at the end of the tunnel here, so maybe that's truly possible for your next projects. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. So take care all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.